One introduction: Rozep view the United States government was on track in the Biden administration to reduce the prices for both clean energy heat pumps and clean energy electric cars. Trump tariffs are expected to upset those plans to prevent future air pollution and prevent climate change. The United States government should, instead of certifying wood stoves as safe when they are not safe, go forward with regulations that ban wood stove use and direct government money for use of forest refuse only. For home building and furniture building, for just a few examples of use of forest products for non-burning uses, it is well known from scientific and medical research that wood burning is a substantial source of PM 2.5 emissions, yet the wood burning industry uses the scientifically debunked theory named carbon neutrality of wood burning to argue that wood burning replacing coal burning in industry, and in a trickle-down argument that wood burning should continue for home heating should continue. Presumably because it is called renewable, wood may be renewable in the sense that a tree can be planted in the place of a cut-down burned tree, but it takes centuries or decades for the newly planted tree to attain the stature of the cut-down burned tree. During those centuries or decades, photosynthesis, which converts CO2 to oxygen and so sequesters some carbon, will not take place at the same rate as photosynthesis was performed previously, and wood burning emits both CO2 and PM 2.5, and PM 2.5 is not absorbed by trees, so PM 2.5 is not diminished by planting a tree in the place of a cut-down and burned tree. In fact, a living tree closes its pores against the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning, just as humans hold their breath in the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning. And when a tree closes its pores, the level of photosynthesis that absorbs CO2 pollution goes down. Wood burning emits 90% PM 2.5 particulate matter of 2.5 micrometer size, the perfect size to infiltrate the human lungs, setting off a cascade of human health problems and early deaths. Contrary to many beliefs, wood burning emits 2.8 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel coal burning, and wood burning emits 450 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel natural gas burning. Replacing coal burning with wood burning creates more air pollution in the form of CO2 and PM 2.5 than coal burning. This emission data comes from testing the cleanest burning wood stove in the United Kingdom, the eco-design wood stove, and international convention does not count the emissions from wood burning. The emissions from wood burning are erased from all countries around the world when calculating if each country has met its climate goals. This non-counting or erasure of wood burning emissions data from climate goals does not mean wood burning emissions do not exist. Rozep view purple air PM 2.5 monitors hanging from the eaves of the house of a near neighbor should be used to measure the level of PM 2.5 in the air hyperlocally in the yards of near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners. If PM 2.5 levels exceed World Health Organization standards of 5 micrograms per cubic meter annually, then that evidence of air pollution from wood burning should lead to the shutdown of that indoor residential wood burning appliance, one appliance at a time if necessary.
Hi, my name is Lily. Andrew gave you the intro to Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates and their concern for air pollution from indoor residential wood burning. Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates, or ROSEP, would like every near neighbor of an indoor residential wood burner whose wood smoke enters their yards and sickens the near neighbors to have a purple air PM 2.5 monitor hanging from the eaves of their home to measure the level of PM 2.5 entering their yards. That measurement of air pollution should be used as evidence of unnecessary air pollution, and each indoor residential wood burner should be shut down based on that evidence, one indoor residential wood burner at a time if necessary. The presentation by Andrew ended at 2 minutes 5 seconds. The same presentation by Emma starts at 2 minutes 3 seconds before the end of this podcast. So I am Lily, your timekeeper, and you can start the next podcast at 2 minutes 5 seconds in if you would not like to see the presentation by Andrew a second time. This presentation by me, Lily, ends at 5 minutes in. What you will see in the main content of this ROSEP podcast will be news about air pollution from indoor residential wood burning, and how that air pollution is being combated by ordinary people just like you who are unfortunately near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners at this time. There will also be news about unnecessary and highly polluting use of wood as fuel in industrial wood burners and preventable air pollution from wood burning wildfires. There will also be news about air pollution from PM 2.5 from gas-powered cars. There will also be news about airborne diseases which are also preventable with vaccines such as COVID-19 and measles and whooping cough, to name just a few. In 2025, Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates is also concerned with combating the Trump destruction of government funding for programs which protect human health through the Department of Health and Human Services, and Trump destruction of programs which fund the science and medical research plan to protect human health from preventable illnesses. Protecting human health is a patriotic act, and our defense against enemies is weakened if we are not as healthy as we can be. Heat pump rebates are now offered by the federal government, distributed through the eligible United States, are available in 2025, and are the best, cleanest, and now cheapest alternative to indoor residential wood burning if that burning is actually done to purportedly save money. Wind and solar as sources of the electricity that powers heat pumps and electric cars is also cheaper than burning wood. The adverse health effects that are caused by indoor residential wood burning also come at a cost to near neighbors, both in shortening and ending their lives, and in actual hospital, clinic, and funeral costs. Instead of being compensated monetarily, near neighbors should instead be able to achieve immediate relief by stopping indoor residential wood burning in their hyper-localized neighborhoods, which relief readings from purple air PM 2.5 monitors used as evidence of air pollution will help them achieve. Welcome to news about hopeful scientific and medical achievements that will also help us achieve the goal of clean air to breathe.
Episode 57 DHQ May 19th. 2025 Liberal Poland center-right Portugal and Centrist Romania win elections. In episode 57 DHQ 1 Poland, Portugal and Romania elections, Centrists win over Far Right Nationalists, which include at least one Trumpist, 2 United States Trump budget bill progress in the House of Representatives cutting Medicaid and Green Subsidies in order to fund tax breaks for the rich. 3 United States Biden has stage 4 prostate cancer. 4 Romania A Trumpist Nationalist loses an election. 5 United States Congress get it done. Democrats want Trump to eliminate Wall Street tax break. He has long targeted 6 under Trump. The U.S. is alone in its climate denial. 7 in Eastern Europe, centrists hold off 2 Nationalist Challenges Presidential elections on Sunday in Romania and Poland. Halted, or at least slowed hard right breakthroughs that many liberals had feared, but discontent with mainstream parties lingers. 8 13 ways to save health and science. 9 Republican hypocrisy reaches into the countryside. 10 why we are rooting for Merz, the conservative Chancellor of Germany. 11 the Portugal center-right wins election but falls short of majority. 12 the Trump push to defund Harvard prompts clash over veteran suicide research. 13 Britain and EU strike landmark post-Brexit reset deal. 14 United States House of Representatives key House panel approves the Trump Megabill after conservatives relent. 15 United States House of Representatives letters to the editor. The surprising plea of Republican Senator Josh Hawley for Medicaid readers respond to the argument of the Missouri for protecting Medicaid from cuts. 16 the FDA approves the Novavax COVID vaccine with stricter new conditions. The agency narrowed who can get the shot and added new study requirements that could cost the company tens of millions. 17 one thing helping the Trump approval rating. Some people are not paying attention. 18 Minnesota, the miners who lost their jobs but not their faith in the Trump tariffs. 20 the public broadcasting service PBS in America. Can she keep PBS on the air? Paula Kerger, the chief executive of PBS, is used to fights over funding for the public broadcaster. 21 the GOP tax bill may hurt the lowest earners and help the richest. Even though most Americans may see lower taxes, the spending cuts of the Republicans could outweigh those benefits and leave some worse off. 22 Trump cannot escape political gravity. 3 writers on the Trump polling. 23 RFK Jr., the health secretary, says not to take medical advice from him. 24 which podcasts rule. YouTube. A new list comes with surprises. YouTube, now the most popular platform for consuming podcasts, is introducing a chart ranking shows by watch time. 25 cooking the books. Fears Trump could target statisticians if data disappoints. Proposed rule change could pave way for president to fire economists whose figures prove politically inconvenient. Main content. 1 Poland, Portugal and Romania elections, Centrists win over Far Right Nationalists, which include at least one Trumpist. On May 18th, 2025 Liberal Poland Civic Platform PO Party leader Rafał Trzaskowski and Center-Right Democratic Alliance AD Portugal leader Luis Montenegro and centrist pro-European Union Romania Nicuser Dan won presidential elections against conservative Poland right-wing Peace Party leader Karol Nawacki and against Portugal right-wing Chega Party leader Andrei Ventura and against Romania right-wing nationalist leader George Simeon, who admires Trump. However, in Poland, because Rafał Trzaskowski did not win with 50% of the vote, there will be a runoff between Rafał Trzaskowski and Karol Nawacki on June 1st, 2025. And in Portugal, votes from abroad, which will be counted in the coming days, could still put the Chega Party in second place, which would be the first time in almost 40 years that the socialists do not finish in the top 2 spots in the Polish government. 19. South Korea, it is all about the Trump tariffs. Asia flocks to U.S. trade official. 2 United States Trump budget bill progress in the House of Representatives cutting Medicaid and Green Subsidies in order to fund tax breaks for the rich. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. Substack letters from an American. Heather Cox Richardson, May 18th, 2025. Tonight, late on a Sunday night, the House Budget Committee passed what Republicans are calling their big beautiful bill to enact the Trump agenda, although it had failed on Friday when far-right Republicans voted against it, complaining it did not make deep enough cuts to social programs. The vote tonight was a strict party line vote, with 16 Democrats voting against the measure, 17 Republicans voting for it, and 4 far-right Republicans voting. Present House Speaker Mike Johnson, RLA, said there would be minor modifications to the measure. Representative Chip Roy, RTX, wrote on X that those changes include new work requirements for Medicaid and cuts to green energy subsidies, and so the bill moves forward. Republicans are in a tearing hurry to push that big beautiful bill through Congress before most of us can get a handle on what is in it. Just a week ago, there was still no specific language in the measure. Republican leaders did not release the piece of the massive bill that would cut Medicaid until last Sunday night, and then announced the Committee on Energy and Commerce would take it up. Not even a full 2 days later, on Tuesday, before the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office could produce a detailed analysis of the cost of the proposals, the committee markup happened in a 26-hour marathon in which the parts about Medicaid happened in the middle of the night, and now the bill moves forward in an unusual meeting late on a Sunday night. Medicaid cuts are extremely unpopular, and the Republicans hope to jam those cuts through by claiming they are cutting waste, fraud, and abuse without leaving enough time for scrutiny. If they are truly interested in savings, they could turn instead to the privatized part of Medicare, which is Medicare Advantage. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that cutting overpayments to Medicare Advantage when private insurers upcode care to place patients in a higher risk bracket could save more than $1 trillion over the next decade. Instead of saving money, the big beautiful bill actually blows the budget deficit wide open by extending the 2017 tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that those extensions would cost at least $4.6 trillion over the next 10 years, and while the tax cuts would go into effect immediately, the cuts to Medicaid are currently scheduled not to hit until 2029, enabling the Republicans to avoid voter fury over them in the midterms and the 2028 election. The prospect of that debt explosion led Moody's on Friday to downgrade U.S. credit for the first time. Since 1917 following Fitch, which downgraded the U.S. rating in 2023, and Standard & Poor's, which did so back in 2011, if the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is extended, which is our base case, Moody's explained it will add around $4 trillion to the federal fiscal primary, excluding interest payments deficit over the next decade. As a result, we expect federal deficits to widen, reaching nearly 9% of GDP by 2035, up from 6.4% in 2024, driven mainly by increased interest payments on debt rising, entitlement spending, and relatively low revenue generation. On the Sunday talk shows this morning, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent dismissed the downgrade, saying it reflected conditions already in the market, although Moody's explicitly said it was concerned about the potential passage of the Republican Big Beautiful Bill. House Speaker Mike Johnson said that the credit downgrade just proved the need for the measure with its historic spending cuts to pass, although Moody's named that bill as its reason for the downgrade. The continuing Republican insistence that spending is out of control does not reflect reality. In fact, discretionary spending has fallen more than 40% in the past 50 years as a percentage of gross domestic product, from 11% to 6.3%. What has driven rising deficits are the George W. Bush and Trump tax cuts, which had added $8 trillion and $1.7 trillion respectively to the debt by the end of the 2023 fiscal year. But rather than permit those tax cuts to expire or even to roll them back, the Republicans continue to insist Americans are overtaxed. In fact, the U.S. is far below the average of the 37 other nations in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development (OECD), an intergovernmental forum of democracies with market economies, in its tax levies, according to a report by the Center for American Progress in 2023. If the U.S. taxed at the average OECD level over 10 years, it would have an additional $26 trillion in revenue. If the U.S. taxed at the average of European Union nations, it would have an additional $36 trillion. But instead of considering taxes to address the deficit in the 2024 campaign, Trump insisted that foreign countries would pay for further tax cuts through tariffs, no matter how often economists said that tariffs are passed on to consumers. In October 2024, when editor-in-chief of Bloomberg News, John Micklethwait, corrected the Trump misunderstanding of the way tariffs work in an interview at the Economic Club of Chicago, Trump replied, "It must be hard for you to, spend 25 years talking about tariffs as being negative, and then have somebody explain to you that you are totally wrong," referring to analysis that his plans would explode the national debt, including analysis by the Wall Street Journal, hardly a left-wing outlet. Trump replied, "What does the Wall Street Journal know? They have been wrong about everything. So have you. By the way, you have been wrong about everything. You have been wrong all your life on this stuff." The Walmart suggestion that it will have to raise prices because of tariffs is forcing the administration to try to manage reality. "We are wired for everyday low prices, but the magnitude of these increases is more than any retailer can absorb," the Walmart chief financial officer John David Rainey during an interview with CNBC on Thursday. Rainey predicted higher prices by June. In response, Trump appeared to agree that tariffs are paid by consumers, posting that Walmart should eat the tariffs and not charge valued customers anything. "I will be watching, and so will your customers." Today, Bessent reassured Americans that he had spoken to the CEO of Walmart, Doug McMillon, who had agreed that Walmart would in fact eat some of the tariffs. "So with the current Big Beautiful Bill, we are looking at a massive transfer of wealth from ordinary Americans to those at the top of American society." The Democratic Women's Caucus has dubbed the measure the Big Bad Billionaire Bill, lest there be any confusion about who will benefit from this big, beautiful bill. One of the many pieces tucked into it is a prohibition on any state laws to regulate artificial intelligence for the next 10 years. Despite its gargantuan energy demands, harm to the environment, and threats to privacy, the administration is pushing AI hard, and leading AI entrepreneurs in the U.S., including Elon Musk, Sam Altman of OpenAI, Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, Ruth Porat of the Google parent company Alphabet, and Andy Jassy of Amazon, all traveled with Trump to Saudi Arabia last week. The Saudis are looking to diversify their oil-dependent economy and are now the largest investors in artificial intelligence in the world. Speaker Johnson hopes to pass the bill through the House of Representatives by this Friday, before Memorial Day weekend. Free United States. Biden has stage 4 prostate cancer. In other news today, the office of former President Joe Biden announced he is battling an aggressive form of prostate cancer. As Vice President and President Biden was a fierce advocate for cancer research, with the goal of reducing the death rate from cancer by at least 50% by 2047, preventing more than 4 million deaths from cancer, and improving the experience of individuals and families living with and surviving cancer. For Romania, a Trumpist nationalist loses an election. And in international news, Romanian voters today rejected a Far Right nationalist who deliberately styled his behavior after Trump, and whose victory until recently was being treated as a foregone conclusion. Instead, voters elected the centrist mayor of Bucharest, Nicușor Dan. Even before the election, the opponent of Dan insisted the election was illegitimate, claimed that he was the new leader, and called for his supporters to protest in favor of his election. But in the end, the 8-point victory of Dan was too much to overcome, and he conceded. "This is your victory," Dan told his supporters. "It is the victory of thousands and thousands of people who campaigned and believe that Romania can change in the correct direction." 5 United States Congress get it done. Democrats want Trump to eliminate Wall Street tax break. He has long targeted excerpts edited by Rozef for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. USA Today, May 19, 2025. Washington. A group of Democratic senators are calling on Trump to push congressional Republicans to end a Wall Street tax break he has long had in his sights. In a letter sent to Trump on May 18th and first obtained by USA Today, 10 Democratic senators highlighted the Trump long-standing interest in eliminating what is known as the carried interest loophole. It is a tax break that allows venture capital private equity equity and hedge fund managers to pay a lower tax rate for certain earnings than they would if it was taxed as regular income. Investment fund managers pay 23.8% tax on carried interest, which is the profits they make from assets like stocks and bonds, even though it makes up most of their earnings. It is currently treated as a return on investment rather than typical income, which is taxed at 37% for the top earners in America. Trump campaigned on eliminating the tax break in 2016, telling CBS News that the financiers are getting away with murder. A lot of them. It is like they are paper pushers. They make a fortune. They pay no tax. It is ridiculous, he said at the time. Trump, along with Vice President J.D. Vance and Peter Mandelson, British ambassador to the United States, addressed reporters in the Oval Office at the White House on May 8, 2025 in Washington, D.C., but Trump could not get the change included in his 2017 economic legislation, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, amid an intense lobbying campaign from the industry and some GOP lawmakers to protect the break. Wall Street voices say the provision allows them to support more jobs and makes them more competitive around the world now that Republicans in Congress are crafting a new sweeping tax and spending package. Trump is again pushing congressional leaders to eliminate the carried interest advantage. In the initial version of the bill released on May 12, House lawmakers left it out, meaning the loophole would survive. It is clear that the private equity industry has fought hard to retain these extraordinary tax giveaways, the Democratic senators wrote in the letter to Trump. What is less clear is whether you will allow your party to deviate from your commitments, bow to industry demands, and fail to close the loophole for a second time. The letter, led by Sen's Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts and Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, was also signed by Sen's Chris Van Hollen, D. Maryland Sheldon Whitehouse, D. Rhode Island Jeff Merkley, D. Oregon Ron Wyden, D. Oregon Amy Klobuchar, D. Minnesota Jack Reed, D. Rhode Island Peter Welch, D. Vermont, and Bernie Sanders, I. Vermont. The senators wrote that the tax writing committee of the House defied your wishes by advancing legislation that does not eliminate the loophole. So Trump, will you get it done? They asked. The letter prods at a rare point of overlap between Trump and some of the most progressive congressional Democrats, and a break between Trump and Republicans in Congress. In addition to leaving out the carried interest provision, lawmakers have not adopted the Trump proposal of raising taxes on some of the wealthiest Americans to offset lost revenue from his other tax cuts. 6. Under Trump, the U.S. is alone in its climate denial. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization, the New York Times Climate Forward newsletter, May 19, 2025. At the 2025 United Nations Climate Conference, China is expected to set a very ambitious goal to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. India recently overtook Germany to become the third largest generator of renewable power in the world. The European Union, where greenhouse gas emissions have been falling, is now generating 11% of its electricity from solar power, surpassing coal for the first time in the United States. Under Trump, the largest economy in the world is rolling back emissions regulations, ramping up the production of fossil fuels, and dismantling federal efforts to monitor and respond to climate change. As I report in a new article, the United States now stands virtually alone on the world stage in its disregard for the growing threats posed by a rapidly warming world, even as global temperatures reach record highs and extreme weather causes more death and destruction. But the Trump administration is turning a blind eye to the reality that climate change is a major threat to countries around the world, including the United States. More than that, the White House is undermining the capacity of the United States to understand the science of a warming planet and to prepare for the consequences. The administration is firing scientists, shuttering long-running research projects that monitor our changing atmosphere, and canceling major reports that detail how a hotter planet will impact the economy. It is also scaling back its efforts to help when disaster strikes, closing programs that were designed to make communities more resilient to extreme weather, and denying requests for assistance after deadly storms. Taken together, these moves are poised to leave the country less prepared and over time more polluted. They are also set to complicate the global climate talks that begin this November in Brazil. The Trump administration has not indicated if it is planning to send a delegation to the gathering known as COP30, but the White House has so far shown no appetite to engage with the rest of the world on the issue of global warming. On the Trump first day in office, he signed an executive order that would make the United States the only country to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. Headlines: The New York Times, May 19, 2025. In Eastern Europe, centrists hold off 2 nationalist challenges. The New York Times. Joe Biden is diagnosed with an aggressive form of prostate cancer. The New York Times opinion: 13 ways to save health and science in America. The New York Times opinion: Republican hypocrisy reaches into the countryside. The New York Times opinion: The Moody's downgrade is an alarm. Washington better pay attention. The New York Times opinion: Washington needs this medicine. The Trump formula is poison. The New York Times opinion: Why we are rooting for Friedrich Merz, the conservative Chancellor of Germany. The New York Times. Pope Leo meets with J.D. Vance as U.S. conservatives hopes for better relations. The New York Times. The Portugal center right wins election, but falls short of majority. The New York Times. Russia beefs up bases near the Finland border. The New York Times. The president of South Africa to challenge Trump on Afrikaner refugees. The New York Times. Stocks fall and bond yields jump on concerns about U.S. debt. The New York Times. Trump live updates Russia, Ukraine ceasefire, push taxes and immigration bill, and more. The New York Times. The Trump push to defund Harvard prompts clash over veteran suicide research. The New York Times. UK and EU strike Brexit reset deal. The New York Times. What a prostate cancer diagnosis like. That of Biden means for patients. The New York Times. Will the Trump trade war turn the auto parts capital of Canada into a ghost town? The New York Times. 7. In Eastern Europe, centrists hold off 2 nationalist challenges presidential elections on Sunday. In Romania and Poland, halted or at least slowed hard right breakthroughs that many liberals had feared, but discontent with mainstream parties lingers. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. New York Times, May 19, 2025. The political center eroded by nationalist forces aligned With Trump held in the end, but only just presidential elections on Sunday in Romania and Poland, the two most populous countries on the European formerly communist Eastern Fringe halted, or at least slowed a hard-right breakthrough that many liberals had feared, but they also pointed to growing discontent with established political parties no matter their ideological tilt, a trend that is likely to generate future turbulence as old and predictable loyalties fade in Romania. A centrist mayor, who campaigned as an independent untainted by close ties to two long-dominant mainstream parties widely viewed as corrupt, defeated another outsider, a hardline nationalist who aligned himself with Trump and had been seen as the front-runner. Nicuser Dan, the mayor of the Romanian capital Bucharest, won a decisive victory over George Simion in a runoff for the Romanian presidency, confounding expectations of a sharp turn to the right. He won 54% of the vote, boosted by an unusually high turnout of 64%. The result Sunday delighted mainstream political leaders across Europe and also the executive arm in Brussels of the European Union, whose president Ursula von der Leyen congratulated voters for having chosen the promise of an open, prosperous Romania in a strong Europe. Simion, who on Sunday responded to early results that showed him losing with cries of fraud and Trump-like vows to stop the steal, curbed his fury early Monday, conceding defeat and dropping complaints of irregularities in a somber video address. Poland delivered a far less emphatic rebuff to EU skeptic nationalism, with hard-right candidates, including a pugnacious anti-Semite, taking second, third, and fourth places in the first round of a closely watched presidential race. Rafał Trzaskowski, the liberal mayor of Warsaw and an ally of Prime Minister Donald Tusk, still came in first, that secured him a slot in a runoff on June 1st against the second-place finisher Karol Nawrocki, a nationalist historian backed by the previous governing party of Poland, the Law and Justice Party, but the margin of his victory, 31.3% of the vote to the 29.5% of Nawrocki, according to the official count, was so small, and support for hard-right candidates so strong that a repeat win for Trzaskowski in the runoff is far from certain. Like Simion in Romania, Nawrocki positioned himself during the campaign as part of an unstoppable global movement, visiting Washington in early May for a meeting in the White House with Trump, who gave him a thumbs-up. Tusk and other members of his government have yet to be received by Trump. Nawrocki also joined forces with Simion, receiving the Romanian Nationalist candidate at a campaign event this month in the Polish town of Zabrze. The two main parties of Poland secured slots in the runoff, but their share of the vote, around 60%, was unusually small. Trzaskowski and Nawrocki had only received support from their core electorates. This is the worst result ever for the two leading parties. 13 Ways to Save Health and Science, excerpts edited by Rozeb for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against would smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, May 19, 2025. The early months of Trump have brought sweeping changes to the American scientific and medical landscape. Deep cuts to research funding and widespread layoffs have threatened progress in medicine, energy, climate science, and other key fields, areas where the United States has long been a global leader. The future is uncertain, but decline is not inevitable. Times Opinion asked experts across disciplines to share concrete ways that individuals, organizations, and local leaders can keep science and health efforts moving forward. Here are their ideas. 1. Protect vaccination drive. Margaret Hamburg, former Food and Drug Administration Commissioner, as the Trump administration moves to halt areas of vaccine research, drops funding for vaccine clinics, and deletes vaccine information from government websites. It is crucial to find ways to ensure that vaccine availability and use remains grounded in the best available science. The Vaccine Integrity Project is a new initiative that will be making recommendations about how to continue vaccination programs to avert death, disability, and hospitalizations from preventable diseases. We see it as a precaution against potential threats, including the politicization of a Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Vaccine Advisory Committee and unchecked expansion of the measles and whooping cough outbreaks, or the loss of state and local immunization program support. 2. Get creative with state policies. Josh Green, governor of Hawaii, in May, Hawaii became the first state to pass a climate impact fee that will enable us to protect ourselves against future climate-related disasters like the devastating Maui fires. A small 0.75% increase in the hotel tax for all travelers to Hawaii will generate $100 million per year, which may also be used to bond $1 billion annually. These resources will fund new research, development, and deployment of strategies to mitigate the impacts of climate change, such as reducing carbon emissions, protecting and restoring ecosystems, and building climate-resilient infrastructure and communities. This is just one example of how state and local governments can take control of their own fates and survive harsh federal cuts. 3. Get mad in. Public scientists are trained to support conclusions with evidence, not emotion, but rational arguments cannot stop irrational decisions. The people firing scientists and erasing data will tell you coal is clean, the climate is not changing, and weather forecasting is unimportant. They are lying in response. Scientists can tell the truth, not just in papers and talks, but in the media, in our communities, and on the streets. The fear of retaliation is real, and not everyone can speak up, but those of us who can should get angry, get loud, and show that mad scientists are a force to be reckoned with. 4. File a lawsuit. Days after the Trump administration purged thousands of pages from federal public health agency websites, Doctors for America, an advocacy organization of over 27,000 physicians and medical students, filed a lawsuit to restore and protect these essential sources. The websites contain critical resources for treating patients, data to improve medical practices in public health, and guidance to ensure that clinical trials for new treatments are designed to reflect demographics in the real world. We were successfully granted a temporary restraining order that has led to the restoration of several of these websites, and we continue to fight in court for access to them. 5. Lean on other scientists. Scientific societies, professional organizations that represent researchers in specific fields have a long history of stepping in when politics interferes with research. After the Trump administration suspended work in April on the U.S. government flagship report on the impacts of climate change, the American Geophysical Union and the American Meteorological Society partnered with plans to publish some of the research so the public can still access the findings as the government terminates studies on environmental risks. we are helping local communities do the work themselves. 6. Donate effectively. 7. Create a mini NIH. Propose the creation of the American Research Collaborative, a kind of mini national institutes of health that could provide funding for universities. The ARC would be led by a governing board elected by member organizations like the American Heart Association, the American Cancer Society, and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. 8. Use opioid settlement funds for addiction care. 9. Support patient-led research early in the COVID-19 pandemic. A strained healthcare system and confusing messages left those of us developing long COVID without guidance. So we built our own resources and infrastructure. The body politic COVID-19 support group grew to over 14,000 members in over 30 countries. Peer-to-peer support is always important, but it becomes vital during new disease outbreaks. 10. Join a humanitarian aid organization. Doctors Without Borders. Even if our government will not show up, we still can 11. Build new alliances. United by Nature will have a governing body, advisors and partners. Independent peer review and extensive public engagement. It is a phoenix rising from the ashes, a new alliance of scientists, engineers, economists, health experts, policy experts, funders, businesses, conservation organizations, and artists, all determined to deliver what the federal government should be doing, but is not. 12. Replace research into vulnerable groups. 13. Call your senator. Really, federal budget cuts to this infrastructure cannot be replaced by the private sector and will also encourage a brain drain of scientists and researchers. We will be relegated to importing blockbuster medications from other countries. This is preventable if Congress refuses to accept these devastating cuts. Americans must directly implore their representatives and senators to take action. These calls make a difference. 9. Republican hypocrisy reaches into the countryside. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, May 17, 2025. Trump won his second term in office with the overwhelming support of rural America. Not only was overall turnout up in the rural counties in America, but Trump won many of those areas by more than 2 to 1. And while it is a little too much to say that the Trump dominance with rural voters delivered him the White House, it is true that without this overperformance, his path to victory would have been harder. Given the importance of rural voters to his political coalition, you might assume that Trump would prioritize the interests of rural voters. Not so for Trump and his Republican allies in Congress. If anything, their agenda is calibrated to devastate rural America. Consider the budget proposal now making its way through the House of Representatives to pay for their $3.8 trillion tax plan, which includes possibly trillions in tax cuts and extensions for the wealthiest Americans. Republicans want to cut $700 billion for Medicaid and other federal health programs. If passed into law, these cuts, some which come in the form of work requirements for Medicaid, could cause as many as 8.6 million Americans to lose their health insurance. As the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities notes, rural areas in particular depend on Medicaid spending. Nearly half of all children in rural areas, 47%, receive health insurance through Medicaid. Rural hospitals, which have struggled to stay afloat in the face of broad and overlapping challenges, also rely on Medicaid to stay open and provide needed services to isolated areas. House Republicans also want to slash the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program SNAP to reduce so-called waste, fraud, and abuse. These cuts, which will effectively pay for tax benefits for people with higher incomes, will most likely hit children and other vulnerable populations hardest. And as with the proposed Medicaid cuts, this will hit hard for rural areas, where roughly 1 in 7 households receives SNAP benefits. Rural residents are also older on average than non-rural residents, and older adults can face particular challenges maintaining steady employment, including health challenges, and this is all on top of the Trump trade wars, which threaten to upend rural producers of agricultural goods, as well as his unilateral moves to try to slash funding for rural broadband and to try to roll back the production of clean energy, at one point freezing grants for farmers and rural business owners who purchased renewables such as solar panels. The policy agenda of the Republican Party is hostile to the economic interests of the millions of Americans who live in rural areas, but no one seems to want to ask Republicans, or Trump for that matter, to explain the yawning distance between what they promise for rural Americans and what they actually do for rural Americans. If Trump and the Republican Party can successfully cut Medicaid and SNAP to pay for upper income tax cuts, they will almost certainly plunge millions of people, including many of their supporters, into poverty, possibly made worse by the economic disruption of the Trump trade agenda. 10. Why we are rooting for Merz, the conservative Chancellor of Germany. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, May 17, 2025. The Alternative for Germany, a far-right political party, is among the most extreme major parties in the world. It echoes Nazi messaging. It has ties to President Vladimir Putin of Russia, and it traffics in anti-Muslim and anti-Semitic language. The party, known as the AfD, an abbreviation of Alternative for Deutschland, is so extreme that Marine Le Pen, the leader of the French far-right, broke with it. The AfD is also alarmingly popular. It finished second in the 2025 parliamentary elections and first among voters younger than 45, as many Germans have become frustrated with the German direction, especially its struggling economy and surging immigration. They have blamed the mainstream parties that have been in charge for decades. These voters have looked for an alternative, and the very name of AfD appeals to their discontent. For all these reasons, we are rooting for the success of the new Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz. He is a 69-year-old lawyer who leads the German center-right Christian Democrats, the only group to finish ahead of the AfD in the February elections. Merz has a tough job ahead of him. He sits atop an unwieldy governing coalition that includes the center-left Social Democratic Party, which finished third. The necessity of that grand coalition reflects the popularity of the AfD. It won so many votes that neither the center-right nor the center-left could form a government without the other. The breadth of the coalition has the potential to be its undoing. If it cannot agree on policies and slides into dysfunction, it will give voters more reason to reject mainstream parties in favor of the AfD. In the best-case scenario, the recent debt agreement in Germany can become a model for the Merz coalition government. The deal included priorities of both the left and the right. Their lingering differences did not prevent the bill from passing. There will probably be tougher negotiations ahead, but fear can play a useful role in overcoming future disagreements. If the mainstream parties descend into bickering and fail to make tangible progress on the problems in Germany, the likely result is ominous. Even more voters will turn to an extremist, hate-filled Alternative Merz and his governing partners have an opportunity to show that the political establishment can still deliver results. Their success matters for Germany and for liberal democracy. 11. The Portugal center-right wins election but falls short of majority. The hard-right Chega party surged in the snap election, securing its status as a powerful political contender. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, May 19, 2025. The Portugal governing center-right coalition won a snap election on Sunday but failed to secure a majority amid a surge in votes for the hard-right Chega party. While the results are likely to produce little change in the Portugal leadership, they cement the evolution of Chega from a one-time protest movement to a powerful political contender in a country that, unlike others in Europe, had until recently largely shunned the hard-right. The snap election, the third in as many years, was called after the Portugal parliament ousted the year-old center-right government in a vote of no confidence in March. That government, led by Montenegro, had been on a shaky footing from the start, given that it controlled far less than a majority in the parliament, but it was tarnished by a controversy over his business dealings. Chega, which means enough in Portuguese, is the first hard-right party to gain ground in the Portugal political scene since 1974 and the end of the nationalist dictatorship of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. In the last election a year ago, it secured 18% of the vote. Analysts say the party has succeeded in part by capitalizing on anti-immigration sentiment and economic resentments. 12. The Trump push to defund Harvard prompts clash over veteran suicide research. The proposed termination of medical research funded by the VA is part of the Trump broader pressure campaign against the university. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, May 16, 2025. The Trump move to cancel an array of federal contracts at Harvard University has set off an internal clash over the impact on medical research intended to help veterans, including projects involving suicide prevention, toxic particle exposure, and prostate cancer screening. The dispute among officials at the Department of Veterans Affairs has focused in part on a collaboration with Harvard Medical School to develop a predictive model to help VA emergency room physicians decide whether suicidal veterans should be hospitalized. According to the records, canceling that contract would result in more veteran suicides that could have been prevented. An official in the VA Office of Research and Development wrote in a May 8 email asking leaders of the agency to reverse their decision, but a longtime private industry healthcare executive and a senior advisor to Doug Collins, the Veterans Affairs Secretary, said that researchers at other institutions could do the work instead. 13. Britain and EU strike landmark post-Brexit reset deal. The agreement includes a new defense partnership and reduced checks on food and drink, removing some trade barriers after months of negotiations. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, May 19, 2025. Britain and the European Union on Monday struck a landmark deal aimed at boosting security cooperation. While removing some of the barriers to trade introduced by Brexit, the agreement is designed to help the two sides work more closely together, as the United States has signaled it is reducing its commitment to European security, but it also underscores the ambition of British Prime Minister Keir Starmer for a reset of ties with the 27-nation bloc, almost 9 years after Britain's voted by a narrow margin to leave the European Union. It is time to look forward, Starmer said in a statement, to move on from the stale old debates and political fights to find common-sense practical solutions. We are ready to work with partners if it means we can improve the lives of people here at home. Under the deal, British people will be allowed to use electronic gates in Europe when crossing borders, and traveling with pets will be easier too. The sale of some British meat products in the European Union, the biggest trading partner in Britain, will be possible again, and some border checks on animal and plant products will end. The agreement is politically contentious for Starmer and has involved months of difficult negotiations. One of the most delicate issues in the trade talks was an extension of the right of European trawlers to fish in British territorial waters in exchange for reduced trade barriers for British food products entering the EU giant single economic zone. After discussions that continued until almost the last minute, the two sides agreed that they would allow European boats access to UK fishing waters until June 30th, 2038. Worried about a potential backlash among Brexit hardliner, Starmer had already ruled out joining the EU single market or customs union, two measures that would have jolted economic growth, but more limited concessions were required to reach the deal on food exports, requiring Britain to stick to European standards. Starmer will be hoping that concrete benefits to consumers and travelers will outweigh the objections of Brexit supporters. The deal includes plans for a new program to allow young Europeans to travel and work in Britain and vice versa. The war in Ukraine and President Trump approach to European security have changed the climate and increased the sense of urgency for cooperation. At the same time, Britain is pushing for some of its companies to participate in a €150 billion loan program to fund joint defense procurement. This deal could be an early step toward that inclusion. Headlines: The New York Times, May 18, 2025. Centrist wins the Romanian presidential race over hard right nationalist NPR. Romanian Liberal Mayor Nicusur Dan wins tense race for presidency. Center right party wins Portuguese election as far right makes record gains. Portugal, The Guardian. Poland election, Rafał Trzaskowski, the Warsaw Liberal mayor, leads after first round. Nicusur Dan beats George Simeon in the Romanian presidential election. The New York Times. Centrist Dan defeats nationalist Simeon in the Romanian presidential election. The Washington Post. Trump live updates. Key House panel approves the Trump Megabill after conservatives relent. The New York Times. Russia unleashes one of its largest drone barges of the Ukraine war. The New York Times. Poland election, Trzaskowski wins critical vote for president. The New York Times. Opinion: the surprising plea of Republican Senator Josh Hawley for Medicaid. The New York Times. A mini stroke can have major consequences. The New York Times. Democrats who champion the Biden re-election bid now seek atonement. The New York Times. FDA approves Novavax COVID vaccine with stricter new conditions. The New York Times. Moody's downgrades U.S. credit rating below AAA. The New York Times. A reality show where immigrants compete for U.S. citizenship. DHS is considering it. The New York Times. Surgeons perform first human bladder transplant. The New York Times. Why Buttigieg, Walz, Bashir, and other Democrats are already teasing 2028 bids. The New York Times above the law is where lawyers mock firms bowing to Trump. The New York Times one thing helping the Trump approval rating. Some people are not paying attention. The New York Times Trump live updates budget, bill vote tariffs, and Ukraine peace talks. The New York Times suspect in Palm Springs bombing is said to have died in blast. The New York Times gimme a word that explains the Trump worldview. The New York Times energized by RFK Jr. Texas mad moms are chipping away at vaccine mandates. The New York Times Minnesota iron miners lost their jobs, but not their faith in the Trump tariffs. The New York Times rare Chicago dust storm turns day into night. The New York Times J.D. Vance and Pope Leo the backdrop to an inauguration. The New York Times opinion Europe built trains, America built highways, and regret. The New York Times Zelensky meets with Pope Leo. After inaugural mass, the New York Times opinion Trump is destroying a core American value. The world will notice. The New York Times 14 United States House of Representatives key House panel approves the Trump Megabill after conservatives relent. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against would smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times May 18, 2025. The House Budget Committee late Sunday night revived the Trump stalled bill to cut taxes and spending after a handful of fiscally conservative Republicans relented and allowed it to advance. Even as they continued to press for deeper reductions to health and environmental programs, the House Freedom Caucus said in a new statement that its members agree with the ultra-conservative on the Budget Committee, many of whom are members of the Hard Right Caucus themselves, and say the bill does not yet meet the moment. As written, the bill continues increased deficits in the near term with possible savings years down the road that may never materialize. The statement reads, it is a sign that conservative dissatisfaction with the legislation reaches far beyond just the 4 members on the budget panel. This matters because GOP leaders can only lose 3 House Republicans in a vote on the floor. Asked to confirm the Representative Chip Roy assertion that House Republican leaders agreed to move up the timeline for imposing work requirements on Medicaid recipients, Speaker Mike Johnson told reporters they were going to make it happen sooner, as soon as possible. The conservative holdouts who tanked the legislation from advancing out of committee on Friday appear to be voting present now. That vote will allow the bill to move out of committee, but it signals they have not reached any substantive agreements with Republican leadership to win their full support. The vote was 17 for the bill and 16 against and 4 present. 15 United States House of Representatives letters to the editor. The surprising plea of Republican Senator Josh Hawley from Medicaid Readers respond to the argument of the Missouri for protecting Medicaid from cuts. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against would smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times May 18, 2025. A pair of scissors poised to snip the cord of a stethoscope. To the editor regarding the GOP is having our own identity crisis by Josh Hawley, a Republican senator from Missouri. Opinion guest essay May 14, 2025. To my surprise, I found myself respecting the Senator Hawley advocacy for his constituents. He openly acknowledges that stagnant wages, delayed family formation due to financial insecurity, and skyrocketing housing costs are failures of both Democrats and Republicans. More important, despite Republican dominance in Congress and the Supreme Court today, Republican president governing largely by executive order, he is still considering how to deliver real results to his voters. If more Democrats took this approach, prioritizing action over rhetoric, they might regain the trust of frustrated voters. I may never agree with Senator Hawley on most issues, but I respect any leaders willing to hold their own party accountable for the good of the people. This is true leadership. Our country needs more of it. A woman from Shaker Heights, Ohio. To the editor, the Josh Hawley recognition that cuts to Medicaid are not in the interest of working class people is a truth many of us recognize, and his analysis of why that is true is sound. How does he propose to continue the programs? How about leaving the tax law from the Trump first term alone, allowing tax cuts for rich people to expire? If rich Americans have any sense of patriotism, they will recognize that these and other steps to reduce inequality should be taken by Congress to preserve a decent society, to preserve our government by the people, and to preserve a system that has clearly worked in their own interest. If things are as bad as Senator Hawley claims, it would be a failure of our basic decency to deprive needy people of basic care because of money. Way can be found. Senator Hawley understands the plight of Medicaid patients and now needs to lead his colleagues to a responsible resolution to the very real financial issues presented. A man from Carlisle, Massachusetts. 16 The FDA approves the Novavax COVID vaccine with stricter new conditions. The agency narrowed who can get the shot and added new study requirements that could cost the company tens of millions. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against would smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times May 17, 2025. The Food and Drug Administration on Friday approved the Novavax COVID-19 vaccine, but only for older adults and for others over age 12 who have at least one medical condition that puts them at high risk from COVID. The new restriction will sharply limit access to the Novavax vaccine for people under 65 who are in good health. The vaccine had previously been authorized under emergency use. COVID vaccines developed by Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, which are more widely used by Americans, were granted full approval in 2022. However, the companies are working on updated shots for the fall. The new restrictions on the Novavax shot portend a more restrictive approach from the FDA. The FDA new restrictions also appear to reflect the high degree of skepticism about vaccines from Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the health secretary. More on COVID-19 efforts to thwart NA therapies. The therapies a key to COVID vaccines hold great potential in treating several diseases, but some lawmakers want to ban them, and the government is cutting funding. We asked experts about how the technology works, its safety, and its potential in medicine. The Novavax COVID shot was the last to become available during the pandemic because of unexpected manufacturing problems. It has been offered under emergency authorization since July 2022. On Thursday, Dr. Marty Makary, who leads the FDA, said the agency would soon release a new framework for evaluating COVID shots. A meeting is scheduled for this coming Thursday to select the version of the virus that the fall COVID shots will cover. Nuvaxovid is based on a more traditional vaccine platform and is generally thought to have fewer side effects. It has served as an attractive alternative for those who are wary of the newer technology used in the NA vaccines made by Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna. I have been recommending this vaccine for everyone who is NA vaccine reluctant. A woman doctor said she and her 2 sons all opted for Novavax last fall, but none of them would qualify under the new criteria. 17 One thing helping the Trump approval rating. Some people are not paying attention. Voters were more likely to approve of the Trump job performance if they had not been following some of the major news stories of his first 100 days in office. A recent New York Times Siena College poll found excerpts edited by Rozap for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against would smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization, the New York Times, May 18, 2025. The Trump strategy to flood the zone may be working to keep his approval rating from sinking. Even lower voters who have not heard much about some of the many major news events from the first 100 days of the Trump second term have a higher opinion of the job he is doing. According to the latest New York Times Siena College poll, a little under half of the 42% of voters who approved of the job Trump is doing as president said they had not heard much about at least some of the ups and downs of Trump decisions. Voters who said they had not heard much about recent news events had one thing in common: they were much more likely to get their news from social media. There is some evidence that the Trump approval ratings may be falling among voters who pay little attention to the news. It is harder to know whether that drop is more because they are unhappy with current economic conditions and blaming the new administration, or because they are dissatisfied with the news that has filtered through 18 Minnesota, the miners who lost their jobs but not their faith in the Trump tariffs with demand for steel down and a trade war underway. Miners in the Iron Range of Minnesota are feeling the hit, but they hope better times are ahead. Excerpts edited by Rozap for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against would smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization, the New York Times, May 18, 2025. Demand for cars and other big-ticket metal-filled items slumped in 2024, a rough year for the industry. The steel manufacturer Cleveland-Cliffs, which owns the mine where Bird works, reported a $483 million loss for the first 3 months of 2025, which meant jobs were on the line, including his. When Bird 33 found out that he was being laid off, he learned about it in a breaking news segment on the local television station. On one of his days off, some 1,200 Cleveland-Cliffs employees were affected, 600 them in Minnesota. Yet one thing currently uniting Cleveland-Cliffs and Bird, a member of the United Steelworkers Union, is support for the Trump tariffs, a 25% tax on steel and aluminum imports, along with a 25% tariff on all imported cars. A wide range of economists think that the Trump global tariff campaign could hasten an economic downturn. A prolonged downturn or mere slowdown could further dampen demand for steel products. Both the steel companies and the Union of Steelworkers, however, believe that tariffs can help protect and even revitalize domestic production over the long run. Fending off consistently lower-priced Chinese steel produced with cheaper labor and state subsidies is a stated aim of the White House. Bird said that he did not get why Trump wanted to tax everything from coffee to mangoes, but that steel tariffs made sense to him because of the availability, even a current surplus of homegrown, or the potential for more domestic shipbuilding could mean a greater market for American-made steel. The mere possibility of that shift has excited plenty of members in the United Steelworkers Union. Headlines: the New York Times, May 17, 2025. Palm Springs bombing kills 1 and damages fertility clinic. Mayor says the New York Times, what if a grocery store was more like a farmer's market? The New York Times. Headlines: the New York Times, May 16, 2025. It is all about the Trump tariffs. Asia flocks to U.S. trade. Official: the New York Times. Can Paula Kerger keep PBS on the air amid threats from Trump and Congress? The New York Times. Fossil suggests feathered Archaeopteryx probably flew like a chicken. The New York Times. GOP tax bill expected to hurt the lowest earners and help the richest. The New York Times. Hiker or Russian spy. Latvia advises its people how to be on the lookout. The New York Times. Inside the rift over the Trump AI deals in the Gulf. The New York Times. The Newark airport crisis puts spotlight on U.S. air traffic controller shortage. The New York Times. 9 federally funded scientific breakthroughs that changed everything. The New York Times. Opinion: this is less like governing and more like a really nauseating amusement park ride. 3 writers on Trump 2.0. The New York Times. Opinion: how the Democratic Party closed its eyes to the Biden decline. The New York Times. Opinion: is Trump losing a debate? The New York Times. Opinion: Romania is about to experience disaster. The New York Times. Opinion: selling off our public lands is a bad idea. The New York Times. Peace in South Sudan, a nation U.S. helped build, is unraveling. The New York Times. Peace talks between Russia and Ukraine stop after short meeting. The New York Times. Republicans push to put school desegregation officially in the past. The New York Times. RFK Jr. dodges vaccine questions, says not to take medical advice from him. The New York Times. Some New York Democrats deride the Governor Kathy Hochul inflation refund checks as a gimmick. The New York Times. Stephen Colbert on Trumped-up birthday plans. The New York Times. Trump fires hundreds of Voice of America employees. The New York Times. Trump wraps up Middle East tour full of lavish receptions and business deals. The New York Times. The Trump visit makes a splash in Saudi Arabia. The New York Times. Trump Kushner hotel project in Serbia hits a snag, alleged forgery. The New York Times. YouTube releases its ranking of top podcasts in the U.S. The New York Times. 19 South Korea. It is all about the Trump tariffs. Asia flocks to U.S. trade. Official: Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. APEC nations staring down U.S. tariffs jockeyed for time with a U.S. trade representative at a gathering in South Korea. Excerpts edited by Rozap for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against would smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times. May 16, 2025. The gathering of Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation trade ministers, which took place this week on the South Korea resort island of Jeju, was the first opportunity for the group of mostly Asian economies in the United States to meet collectively since Trump announced and then suspended what he called reciprocal tariffs on dozens of trading partners. The heaviest duties were applied to imports from trading partners in Asia. The main attraction at the meeting was the United States trade representative and one of the 2 main negotiators who reached an agreement for a temporary truce on tariffs with China last weekend. Under the agreement, the United States reduced tariffs on Chinese imports to 30% from 145%, and China cut levies on American goods to 10% from 125%. The reprieve is set to expire in early August. Trade tensions between the United States and China, the 2 largest economies in the world, loomed large over the meeting. APEC slashed its economic outlook for the region from projections made 2 months earlier before Trump announced the reciprocal tariffs, which affect more than half of the 21 members of APEC. The group, which accounts for around half of global trade and about 60% of economic output, cut its forecast for growth this year to 2.6% from its previous projection of 3.3%. It cited trade frictions and policy uncertainty. The U.S. is the largest market and the largest economy, so it represents a very significant percentage of the global economy. It will be hard to find a way to replace all these opportunities. 20. The public broadcasting service PBS in America. Can she keep PBS on the air? Paula Kerger, the chief executive of PBS, is used to fights over funding for the public broadcaster, but to her the latest threats feel like all-out effort to take us out. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against would smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, May 16, 2025. Every couple of years, the long-serving chief executive of PBS faces pushback from Congress. It often comes from Republicans who argue that public broadcasters like PBS and NPR are biased and not deserving of the money of taxpayers. Ms. Kerger, 67, has a playbook for how to handle that. We would just fight on the merits, Ms. Kerger said in an interview this week, spelling out the mission, audience, spending priorities, and results of the broadcaster. That is an argument we know how to do, but this year, she said, feels very different. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene called the hearing anti-American airwaves. Then this month, Trump signed an executive order seeking to end all federal funding for PBS and NPR. With the country more connected than ever digitally, is there still a place for PBS when Netflix, YouTube, and so many other options exist? 21. The GOP tax bill may hurt the lowest earners and help the richest. Even though most Americans may see lower taxes, the spending cuts of the Republicans could outweigh those benefits and leave some worse off. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against would smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, May 16, 2025. The Republican tax plan may offer only modest gains to everyday workers, according to a wide range of tax experts, and some taxpayers may actually be left in worse financial shape if the bill becomes law. The latest assessment arrived Friday from the Penn Wharton budget model, a nonpartisan scorekeeper closely watched on Capitol Hill. Economists found that many Americans who make less than $51,000 a year would see their after-tax income fall as a result of the Republican proposal beginning in 2026. The Penn Wharton estimate sought to analyze the full scope of the Republican tax package, computing the effects of the tax cuts as well as the plan to pay for them by slashing federal spending on other programs, including Medicaid and food stamps. Combined, those policies could fall disproportionately on the poorest, including those near or below the poverty line. The economists found people making between about $51,000 and $17,000 could lose about $700 on average in after-tax income beginning in 2026, according to the analysis, when factoring in both wages and federal aid. That reduction would worsen over the next 8 years. People reporting less than $17,000 in income would see a reduction closer to $1,000 on average, also increasing over time, a shortfall that underscores their reliance on federal benefits. By contrast, the top 0.1%, including those with incomes over $4.3 million, would gain on average more than $389,000 in after-tax income in 2026. The data show at one point Trump did call for raising taxes on the wealthy, particularly by creating a new tax bracket for people making more than $2.5 million a year, but the president later backed away from that push as he faced an onslaught of criticism from members of his own party. Even Trump later admitted the idea would be very disruptive. The bill is great, the president posted on Truth Social this week as House Republicans began to advance key portions of his tax agenda, adding the golden age of America will soon be upon us. 22. Trump cannot escape political gravity. 3 writers on the Trump polling. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against would smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, May 16, 2025. As Trump approached 100 days, he saw a steep decline in his approval rating, with numbers unusually low for an American president in his first months, but they were still within the normal range for Trump despite the autocratic orders, the tariff roulette, and Elon Musk. And then over the past 2 weeks, an uptick, so that the average of recent polls gives Trump an approval-disapproval split of about 45% to 51%. All said, should he and his allies be panicked? Just shy of 10% of people who voted for Trump now seem to have regrets, according to the latest Times Siena poll. You can pretty clearly attribute most of this to the tariffs, which also produced some of the lowest consumer confidence numbers since the 2008 recession. Finally, who is the single most effective Democratic communicator right now? Ocasio-Cortez is totally underestimated by Republicans, and I think it is a mistake to underestimate her. I am bullish on our populist moment sticking around, and she is well positioned to channel it for a new generation Bernie Sanders, I guess. The crowds he is getting sometimes in conjunction with Ocasio-Cortez are pretty impressive. He would probably be the front runner for the nomination if he were 10 years younger. 23. RFK Jr., the health secretary, says not to take medical advice from him. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against would smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, May 14, 2025. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the health secretariat vaccine skeptic who has used his position to amplify discredited health theories and promote unconventional medical treatments, ducked questions during a congressional hearing on Wednesday about whether children should be vaccinated for measles, chickenpox, or polio. He said people should not rely on him for medical advice. The issue came up when Representative Mark Hogan, a Wisconsin Democrat on the House Appropriations Committee, asked Kennedy if he would vaccinate his own child for measles. For measles? Probably for measles, Kennedy began to answer before stopping himself. You know what I would say is my opinions about vaccines are irrelevant. I do not want to seem like I am being evasive, but I do not think people should be taking medical advice from me, he said. But Kennedy, who oversees several agencies whose mandate is to give advice and make policy on public health, has repeatedly used his position to weigh in on health topics, including vaccination. He has urged parents of newborns to do your own research on vaccines and suggested the measles vaccine might be unsafe. Kennedy punted, saying that he did not want to give advice about the vaccines. He did, however, misleadingly claim that in Europe they do not use the chickenpox vaccine. Specifically, a 2022 article in Clinical and Experimental Pediatrics stated that 28 European countries use chickenpox vaccines, of which 16 use combination vaccines for chickenpox, mumps, measles, and rubella. Many European countries have also introduced national chickenpox vaccination programs in the last 10 years. 24. With podcast rule YouTube, a new list comes with surprises. YouTube now the most popular platform for consuming podcasts, is introducing a chart ranking shows by watch time excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates of 501c3 nonprofit organization, the New York Times, May 15, 2025. For the first time, YouTube has published its ranking of top podcasts in the United States, offering a fresh perspective on a sprawling landscape there kill. Tony is ranked number 2, just below the reigning king of podcasts, Joe Rogan. There were familiar names on the YouTube list, including Midas Touch in the top 10, but when compared with the existing charts, the YouTube version sometimes seems like a funhouse mirror. While the hit podcast Dateline NBC, for example, was absent, it does not regularly upload episodes to YouTube. The CBS true crime news magazine 48 Hours appeared at number 4 despite its roots in video. YouTube has come to dominate podcasting. It is the preferred service for 1/3 of weekly podcast listeners in the United States, capturing more users than Spotify or Apple Podcasts. YouTube saw something other people did not in video, said Brett Mycelis, a founder of Midas Touch, comparing YouTube against the other platforms, which are now trying to attract more video creators and viewers. Mycelis, who said the chart was a long time coming, was pleased, but not entirely surprised by the number 5 spot of his show. It means our work is getting out there as podcasts broadly continue to rise in influence, helping to sell products, find voters, and spread hot button ideas. The YouTube chart represents another tool for understanding who holds sway with American consumers. For some podcasts, this may require a deeper investment in video, or at the very least ensuring their videos are correctly organized into YouTube playlists, which is critical to the ranking. Kylie Kelsey was among podcast hosts to temporarily unseat Joe Rogan at the top of the charts. Platforms benefit when new names rise to the top. They do not want to see Joe Rogan at number 1 every single week forever. She said discovery drives more listening hours. Sometimes that discovery applies to household names too. The YouTube top 50 included podcasts from legacy television brands such as NBC, Nightly News, 60 Minutes, and Late Night with Seth Meyers-Feldman characterized the chart, where Gen Z social media stars sit alongside cable figures who rose to prominence in the 1990s like Nancy Grace or Tucker Carlson, as a good testament to how those worlds can coexist and hopefully thrive together. Headlines: The Guardian, May 18, 2025. Are we hardwired to fall for autocrats? Evolution. The Guardian: Biden destroyed Harris bid by staying in race too long. Top advisor says in book. Joe Biden. The Guardian: Cooking the books fears Trump could target statisticians if data disappoints Trump. The Guardian 25. Cooking the books fears Trump could target statisticians if data disappoints. Proposed rule change could pave way for president to fire economists whose figures prove politically inconvenient. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates of 501c3 nonprofit organization. The Guardian, May 18, 2025. Summarizing his befuddlement with numbers, Mark Twain observed that there were lies, damned lies, and statistics. The acerbic phrase later becomes so deeply embedded in popular consciousness that it once formed the title to an episode of The West Wing. The NBC portrayal of a fictitious U.S. president, played by Martin Sheen. Now professional economists and number crunchers fear the aphorism could become a White House theme in real life, buffeted by global markets and public opinion, both of which show a wary skepticism of the Trump affinity for trade wars. The president may be about to turn his renowned hostility to truths at odds with what he believes towards public servants charged with producing accurate information. A proposed rule change making it easier to fire civil servants deemed to be intentionally subverting presidential directives could pave the way for the White House to fire statisticians employed to produce objective data on the economy, but whose figures prove politically inconvenient. Experts warn statistics released by agencies such as the Bureau of Labor Statistics (BLS) and the Bureau of Economic Analysis (BEA) are used by the Federal Reserve Bank to set inflation policy and interest rates. They also form the basis on which businesses and investors take decisions. We should view attacks on government data collection as hand in glove with attacks on journalism. Undermining data collection and casting doubt on data that is released is part of a program of undermining the ability of the public to learn the truth. Even a temporary interruption of the established data collecting capacity of the U.S. would be a real tragedy and lead to a permanent loss of knowledge. You cannot go back and fix it. If you have a data series stretching back 50 years, then it gets cut for 2 or 3 years. You no longer have that 50-year data series. You have lost knowledge forever. Users of government statistics should object to the proposed civil service changes before a 30-day window expires on May 23, 2025. The fate of U.S. democracy could hinge on the continued production of accurate figures. In a democracy, you want to be feeding people the right information so they will make the right choices. But if the goal is to destroy democracy, you would want to control the statistics to fit your story. You want to be promoting your own version of reality.
Cat's Corner strategy with Tiger and Leone. Saying the quiet part out loud. Roar. Hi, I am Tiger. Hi, I am Leone. Our human asked us to get up from our naps and start Cat's Corner strategy with Tiger and Leone. She gave us a list of internet allies which we will post for her here. It is better for your mental fitness to go to these websites than to go to bro sites for advice. Substack letters from an American Heather Cox Richardson. Substack your neighborhood epidemiologist. The Midas Touch. The Guardian. The New York Times. One introduction. Rozep view: the United States government was on track in the Biden administration to reduce the prices for both clean energy heat pumps and clean energy electric cars. Trump tariffs are expected to upset those plans to prevent future air pollution and prevent climate change. The United States government should, instead of certifying wood stoves as safe when they are not safe, go forward with regulations that ban wood stove use and direct government money for use of forest refuse only for home building and furniture building. For just a few examples of use of forest products for non-burning uses, it is well known from scientific and medical research that wood burning is a substantial source of PM 2.5 emissions, yet the wood burning industry uses the scientifically debunked theory named carbon neutrality of wood burning burning to argue that wood burning replacing coal burning in industry, and in a trickle-down argument that wood burning should continue for home heating should continue. Presumably because it is called renewable, wood may be renewable in the sense that a tree can be planted in the place of a cut-down burned tree. But it takes centuries or decades for the newly planted tree to attain the stature of the cut-down burned tree. During those centuries or decades, photosynthesis, which converts CO2 to oxygen, and so sequesters some carbon, will not take place at the same rate as photosynthesis was performed previously, and wood burning emits both CO2 and PM2.5, and PM2.5 is not absorbed by trees, so PM2.5 is not diminished by planting a tree in the place of a cut-down and burned tree. In fact, a living tree closes its pores against the presence of PM2.5 from nearby wood burning, just as humans hold their breath in the presence of PM2.5 from nearby wood burning. And when a tree closes its pores, the level of photosynthesis that absorbs CO2 pollution goes down. Wood burning emits 90% PM2.5 particulate matter of 2.5 micrometer size, the perfect size to infiltrate the human lung, setting off a cascade of human health problems and early deaths. Contrary to many beliefs, wood burning emits 2.8 times the PM2.5 as the fossil fuel coal burning, and wood burning emits 450 times the PM2.5 as the fossil fuel natural gas burning. Replacing coal burning with wood burning creates more air pollution in the form of CO2 and PM2.5 than coal burning. This emission data comes from testing the cleanest burning wood stove in the United Kingdom, the Eco-Design Wood Stove International Convention does not count the emissions from wood burning. The emissions from wood burning are erased from all countries around the world when calculating if each country has met its climate goals. This non-counting or erasure of wood burning emissions data from climate goals does not mean wood burning emissions do not exist. ROSEPView purple air PM2.5 monitors hanging from the eaves of the house of a near neighbor should be used to measure the level of PM2.5 in the air hyperlocally in the yards of near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners. If PM2.5 levels exceed World Health Organization standards of 5 micrograms per cubic meter annually, then that evidence of air pollution from wood burning should lead to the shutdown of that indoor residential wood burning appliance, one appliance at a time if necessary.